knows me well will know that horror is my favorite genre. I love it so much. I've seen quite a few horror movies, but I feel like I kind of watch the same ones. There's like a mystery or like some masked guy who's coming to kill everyone or whatever. Those are the ones the cheap jump scare kind. But recently for this class we watched the movie Get Out, which was unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was really unique in the sense of how it was scary because it had like this deeper meaning to it instead of just having like this villain. It was more of an idea of a villain. I had never seen the movie before, but I had heard a lot about it, so I was excited to watch this one for this class. And while watching it and analyzing like how they did their horror, I realized that I wanted to do my end of the semester project on this movie and the idea of elevated horror. This movie, even though it's recent, is one of the main elevated horror movies. Like, it's one of the ones that you think of when you think of the idea of an elevated horror movie. And with the horror genre being so big, there's like so many different subgenres of it, and elevated horror being one of those, I think it's probably one that changed the franchise so much, and it made such a big impact. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. I want to talk a little bit just about the movie Get Out first. One thing I really liked, and that's really important to me, is the opening scene of a movie. I liked that it kind of hooked me in, and I was like, oh, what is happening right now? That opening shot is really important in a movie because you're trying to get people intrigued to watch the rest of it, especially with a movie like this where the meaning is so deep and you're already having to think about that. You really want to get people wanting to think about that. The other thing I liked about the opening shot is that it kind of set the mood for the movie. It was like dark on a street at night, which is terrifying. And even though most of the movie I feel like isn't that kind of vibe because it's more of the idea of horror instead of actually being at night and being scary in that sense, I think it did well with setting that tone at the beginning by putting you in the scary situation in that environment. Another thing I think this movie did really well is it had a lot of reveals and like shocking moments where something, either a character was being revealed as something or he was figuring out something. He was constantly having to figure out things in this movie, and I liked that we were kind of along that journey with him. I always like a good reveal moment, and this one had a lot of those. And instead of jump scares in this movie, I feel like it had a lot of tense moments where people would do something weird and you'd be like, what is happening right now? Or he would be hearing something that was like, oh my gosh. The reveals and the tense moments in this movie I really enjoyed. But back to my claim about elevated horror, which that's kind of a newer term that people are using to describe this subgenre of newer movies. The main difference between normal horror and elevated horror is that elevated horror will have like a metaphorical theme that's an undertone of the entire movie and kind of what the movie is about. So you've got a regular movie like Scream, where Sidney Prescott is probably learning and growing through what she's going through, but there's no overarching theme that's driving the movie and the reason why it's being created. Movies like It Follows, Us, Barbarian, Get Out is one of them. Those all have like a theme that they're trying to show through the horror of the movie, and it's not just some random story. The main difference is the overarching theme, but another difference is that these films tend to be more artsy with how they do their horror. Instead of doing classic jump scares or chase scenes or whatever, they do it in a more thematic and thought-provoking way and more of an eerie tone, I feel like. It's a way to take a genre and kind of create something new with it, and I think that's really cool. I wouldn't say that elevated horror is a new type of genre that's being created right now, because I can look back at like some older movies and call those elevated horror, but the term is newer. People didn't call it back then, but there are plenty of older movies that were creative like this that just were called horror at the time. But I think creating this term and making it official that there is this genre of elevated horror helps filmmakers be able to look at horror in a new way, and it adds more dimension to the genre. People who probably would say that they don't like horror, they can find a love in something like an elevated horror movie instead of an old slasher that they're probably not a big fan of. It just shows that there's so many different ways that you can look at a style or look at a movie and create something. People have so many different ideas, and the fact that you can make a horror movie but it's not in the normal setting, it's not the normal lighting, it's not the normal jump scares or whatever, and you can take a theme from the real world and create that into a horror movie is really creative. And I think that filmmaking like this is just going to keep growing and growing. Get Out was a great example of a movie like this because it really stuck to that theme that it was trying to show. And it created a story that people could find depth in and people could put their own lives in that and find themselves in that. I think elevated horror movies like Get Out have changed and will change more the future of the horror genre. Personally, I still like the fun, loving, jump scare horror kind of movies. That's just my personal taste. But I'm really glad I watched this movie because I'm not sure if I would have watched it because it is an elevated horror movie. I'm not sure if I would have watched it if I hadn't been in the class. So I'm really glad we got to watch this movie in the class and I got to see that other side that I'm not usually watching. And this opens the door to so many other types of movies and so many other types of genres because horror is definitely not the only genre that only has one aspect of it and you can only make it this way. There's so many ways to be creative in filmmaking. I think what I'm going to take away from this study of elevated horror and Get Out is I'm going to look at my films in the future differently and see if there's a way that I can take that extra step, maybe add a special theme to it, something deeper than just what's normal, because that's how you be creative, I guess.